Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you. We are doing this pre-meeting. As you probably know, DTSC is hosting a Soil Smarts webinar and an open house in November and December, because that's when everybody has a lot of free time. And so we want to go over some of the basics and a little bit more in depth about what we think they're going to show the public. We want you to know it going in, so that way you've got your ears open and you're, you know, cynical, critical isn't really the right word, but pretty close and knowing what to look for. So first, we'd like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land that the Santa Susana Field Lab encompasses.
The 2,850 acres of land that constitute the SSFL have been utilized by the Ventureño Chumash, the Tongva, and the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, indigenous communities since prehistory. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants and seek meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural homelands and resources.
Thank you. This is in preparation for next week will be the first online webinar. You'll want to sign up for that if you haven't already. And after that, on the December 10th, they'll have an in-house open person. We'll be there. We'll be having a friendly protest. Again, we always do peaceful protests. And we'll have signs, or you can bring your own 30 minutes before they have their open house.
Can you go back to that really quickly? Because I just want to point out our very first clue. In the fine print over on the left, where they say remote public workshop information, it talks about soil smarts, the next phase of implementing the soil cleanup at SSFL, focusing on the DOE and NASA background cleanup of chemical contamination in soil, leaving out radioactive contamination that isn't supposed to be included in their background cleanup.
So site facts, most of you already know this, that the Santa Susana Field Lab was formerly called Rocketdyne. Many people know it as that, or they know it as the Hill. It was established in the 1940s for rocket testing. And in 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission looked for a remote place to host their dangerous nuclear testing. And even though the Santa Susana did not rank well in this unclassified report you can see right here, which you can get a copy of that on our website, they picked it anyways because it was closer drive time for the scientists. So it was a bad start right from the beginning. Over 30,000 rocket engine tests have left massive contamination in the groundwater and the soil. You can see this little newspaper clipping we found that in just 1 year, they did 4,000 rocket engine tests. The contaminants of concern are what we call the contamination at the Santa Susana Field Lab. That's a fancy science name, contaminants of concern. And you can see that, add 2 more people. You can see that these contaminants, this is just a sample. There's over 350, I believe. But some of these are just very toxic chemicals that we're looking at. And the sodium reactor experiment, if you haven't heard of that, it was probably one of America's worst nuclear meltdowns, possibly even more radiation released than the 3 Mile Island, primarily because they didn't have a containment structure built over the reactor like you see at San Onofre. They pretty much built these in tin warehouses and metal sheds, and in order to prevent a meltdown, they actually vented intentionally radioactive gases out the open door, as you can see in that photo. Because of the SRE meltdown and other nuclear accidents, you can see here we're done on the Department of Energy. By the way, we're going to be saying DOE a lot. That's Department of Energy, DOE. We've gotten to the bad habit of calling it by its acronym. So if we say DOE, we mean Department of Energy. This is Area 4, and you can see all of the different radioactive work that happened in that area, which again was top secret. No one knew off the hill what was going on. 10 nuclear reactors, 1 major nuclear meltdown, the SRE, 3 reactor accidents, plutonium and uranium fuel facilities. They had accident spills, fires, leaks, and an open air pit where they would burn radioactive waste and let it just go all over wherever the wind took it. And as most of us know, because we probably all live somewhere within one of these circles, 700,000 people live within 10 miles of the Santa Susana Field Lab. So it was once a remote area. It is now very populated, and it puts a lot of people at risk of exposure to the contaminants at the site.
We are going to quickly cover the original cleanup agreements. When you hear us talk about wanting them to implement the legally binding cleanup agreements, this is what we're talking about. First, we will do the 2007 consent order. Oh, first we'll talk about the responsible parties. In yellow, you can see the Boeing areas. Boeing has areas 1 and 3 in the southern buffer. NASA is the middle orange, areas 1 and 2, and the Department of Energy has areas 4 and the northern buffer. Next slide. The first cleanup agreement is the 2007 consent order. That was between all 3 responsible parties, DOE, Boeing, NASA, and the state, the Department of Toxic Substances Control. This agreement required cleanup to be done to all the local zoning standards. So that would include both agricultural and residential with garden options, which would mean that the cleanup of the site would allow everyone to be able, if they had lived on the site, to be able to eat the vegetables grown there. That seems safe to me. We were happy with that. That was supposed to be completed by 2017. The next cleanup agreement is the administrative order on consent. You will always hear us say the AOCs. The AOCs are the gold standard of a site cleanup. Unfortunately, Boeing did not sign. NASA and DOE did sign. The AOCs are important and precedent setting because they guaranteed a cleanup to background. Can we go to the next slide so they can see what that means? Cleanup to background means that all of the contamination that is man-made would be removed. There are naturally occurring radionuclides in the environment. That is not what we're discussing. We are saying everything outside of that, everything beyond what would be naturally occurring in the environment would have to be removed with the goal of bringing the site back to its natural state, to the closest possible scenario. But this also includes, which Melissa is going to elaborate on, the protection of cultural and biological resources on site.
You know what, Jenny? I want to add something. We should have added a slide here. Sorry, guys. Just noticing right now.
You can't add a slide right now.
The background cleanup requirements right now, we were talking about the background to radionuclides, but there's also chemical contamination because today we're focusing just on NASA and Department of Energy. We're totally ignoring Boeing for today for this presentation because we don't think it's going to come up in in DTSC's presentation. So the chemical contamination, which we should have put a slide right here that would have talked about the lookup tables. Those are saying how much contamination can be there. It gives out charts. It's this big document about each contaminant and how much contamination has to be removed till it also goes to background, essentially back to natural levels. So it's radionuclides, but it's not just that. It's also chemical contamination that these 2 polluters, or we call them responsible parties, NASA and Department of Energy, are responsible for. Sorry, Jenny.
No, it's okay. But one thing that we should all just think about, we're not going to fight for it. We're not, trying to rehash old business, but the background amounts, the levels of these different contaminants, including radionuclides, well, radionuclides specifically, were set based on a study that was done in 2012. That study was done after 1959's partial nuclear meltdown. So one could say that our background could be elevated beyond what naturally occurring background would be. There's nothing we can do about that. But I just think it's interesting that what we're trying to do is meet the standards that were set in a 2012 study, not a 1945 study.
So in other words, it's not perfect. The background isn't perfect. You'll hear a lot of talk about background cleanup is not attainable. It's actually not this. It's not the unicorn, right? It's real. It's imperfect, but it's fair. It's a good start, and we feel confident that using a background cleanup is going to remove enough contamination to make us safe. It was hard won for sure, and we think that it is our best option going forward for sure. But DTSC will talk about it like it's this unattainable unicorn. That's not accurate. Okay, so biological protections. So the AOC, that agreement that Jenny just talked about, specifically the 2010 agreement that Boeing did not sign, said that there would be a background cleanup. And in that document, it had really important, essentially clauses, these exemptions. Um, and that is to make sure that the biological and cultural features at the site, which we're going to get into right now, that they were protected. But in order to be protected, like the endangered species, for example, and which there are several endangered species that live up at the Santa Susana Field Lab, and that they would not be destroyed, obviously, by the cleanup. Nobody wants that. Cleanup is meant to make things better, not worse. But it was very carefully worded because the writers of the AOC realized, they knew who they were playing with. And so they were very specific that these exemptions, which would exempt a whole area from any cleanup, um, had to be defined by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service. And they would have to issue an official biological opinion with a determination that the implications of the cleanup would violate the Endangered Species Act, right? We're going to get into hammering this out, don't worry. But essentially what we're trying to say is that you're going to see these a lot. These exemptions are going to be one of our new fighting points with the DTSC. And it's only to be used, it says, if reasonable and alternatives, no prudent measures or reasonable alternatives exist that would allow for the use of specified cleanup standards. So essentially, if they couldn't find a way to make it work, and if the cleanup was going to kill an endangered species, then you would exempt it, and the cleanup wouldn't happen in that area. Does that make sense? So here are some of the lovely endangered species and threatened species at the Santa Susana Field Lab. You can see just what an amazing, diverse variety of wildlife and plants. Some really cool little guys, like this ring-tailed cat is related to the raccoon family. And I've lived in California my whole life. I've lived out here. I've never seen one of those guys. They live at the lab. We've got the least Bell's vireo.
I thought you mistakenly put a Madagascar lemur up there,
I
but I'm glad
know.
that's not the
I
case.
know. So we want to talk now about why this background cleanup matters. Just a little reminder that we're not talking about removing, soap residue out of the ground. We're talking about contamination that hurts the wildlife, in addition to when it gets off site and hurts people. So, for example, lead. We've got a lot of lead at the field lab. It's not just at the firing range. I'm not going to go through these extensively right now, but you can come back through the slideshow and read these for yourselves. We had a watershed scientist from Toyo Shumash Foundation help put some of this information together for us about why lead is so dangerous for wildlife. PCBs are incredibly dangerous for wildlife, and we're finding more and more of them now that we're using better detection methods at the field lab.
41 exceedances of PCBs in the first quarter of 2024's NPDES stormwater permit. So they're there in serious amounts.
Yeah, and they're very dangerous and they're long lasting. TCE and chlorinated solvents, you can see, are hugely dangerous for the amphibians and aquatic wildlife. 1,4-dioxane, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, causes all kind of kidney damage, liver damage. Perchlorate, we know exists at the field lab because it was used for the rocket engine tests, and it talks about all the dangers. So this gets to the wildlife through two main processes of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And essentially what that means is that over time, an animal can accumulate it in their body, which can cause serious damage over time. Biomagnification is where it moves up through the food chain till the top predators end up having more contamination than even the small beginnings of the food chain. So this is, again, we're not just talking about a cleanup for the sake of making it smell nice or look nice. This is actually harmful to the wildlife, to these endangered species. Some of the pervasive contaminants hurt the bottom of the food chain. This is critical because this is what all the top predators need to survive, right? It has to start at the bottom of the food chain and be safe the whole way up. These contaminants are known to depress invertebrate and inhibit functions of photosynthesis. We know that they are hurting, these are called top trophic animals. Those are your top predators. Um, Impacts to mountain lions. We're all concerned about the mountain lions right now, especially now that we're aware of that amazing wildlife bridge. They're being directed into the Santa Susana Field Lab where they can be exposed to more contamination. Endangered species, again, they need those healthy bugs to be able to have healthy bodies, to have healthy babies in order to keep the species populations working well, and this contamination can really impact them. We're going to be talking about the Broughton's milk vetch again today, and how these harmful contaminants even hurt the plant life. This quote is really strong. It's from Dr. Frank von Hippel, who's a very well-renowned ecotoxicologist, and said, if this SSFL property is not safe for people, then it certainly is not safe for much of wildlife. And specifically, he was referencing the study by Boeing that found 96 out of 100 people will get cancer if they hypothetically lived on the site and ate the produce they grew there. So if 96 out of 100 people are getting cancer from the site, then we know if it's not safe for people, it's certainly not safe for much of the wildlife. Another point that's really important that we kind of just alluded to when we talked about exceedances is that because the Santa Susana Field Lab is at the top of the plateau, when it rains, huge amounts of soil can be washed down through the rain runoff and into local waterways. And we already know that Boeing's been fined over $1 million for exceedances in the past. And like Jenny just said, we had huge amounts of PCB exceedances. We found huge amounts of lead exceedances in the water runoff just this year. And so that's another reason why the site needs to be cleaned up for the animals who are on site, but also the animals who live right off site and who live in these waterways. There's several watersheds that are connected to the Santa Susana Field Lab, and we need to protect all of the wildlife. Remember how we said that the AOC said that the Fish and Wildlife had to make a determination if there would be exemptions. So again, the Fish and Wildlife had to come in and look at the cleanup and look at the map and say, oh, this area of milk vetch is critical habitat. The whole species could die if you touch it, so don't do the cleanup here. And that would make an exemption. But instead, what we saw in 2013, that Fish and Wildlife did make a determination, and we've got some really strong, shocking quotes here. It's not shocking to us, but I guess if you've never seen it before. They're talking about how they're specifically listing out some of the endangered species on site, which again, those exemptions would have to protect only the endangered species. And they're saying things like the cleanup would actually improve the habitat in the long run. It could cause some effect, but it's not likely to adversely affect. And down here, they're talking about the Broughton's milk vetch, that it might affect, but it's not expected to adversely affect. These are a few samples on our website. If you go to www.parentsagainstssfl, like Santa Susana Field Lab.com, we've got quite a few more determinations, and we've got a link to the document. You can look it up yourself. You can see exactly what we're talking about here. So this letter is saying not only will this not cause the end of any endangered species, it will actually help the endangered species in the long run. Because, like we said, those contaminants, they're dangerous to the wildlife. They're not helpful. They cause harm. Yeah, Jenny.
In a background cleanup scenario.
Yes. Yes. So this is removing all of those contaminants. And then without those contaminants, even though it might cause some disturbances or some impact, in the long run, these animals will actually thrive because of the full cleanup. It's really important that we hold on to that understanding. So we're all good? I want to point out that in 2018, the Department of Energy asked the Fish and Wildlife to do another determination letter. And this one is interesting. I'll just say that. They talk about, you can see here on the map on the right side, that's the Broughton's milk vetch, which is an endangered plant. It's endemic to the Santa Susana Field Lab and a few other areas in Ventura County and Orange County, I believe, too. And they've got that area circled out. You notice that circle? We're going to see it again and when Jenny comes to her maps. In this document, they said that the background cleanup would not be good. They said it would cause too much harm to the wildlife. However, if it's going to cause, like if the contaminants there cause harm to the wildlife, then they should remove it, but also you should exempt it, but also you should clean it up if it's harmful. Right? So you can see this quote here. It says that its critical habitat, the effects of the cleanup would be substantial. They recommend the exemption to say don't do any cleanup here, but only to the soils that contain contaminants. So even though it's an exemption, you should still clean it up within that area, because that contamination would pose a risk to human health and environment. So I don't know if they didn't quite understand the way the exemptions were meant to work, but you'll see that DOE took it and ran with it. They did not take this as a means to say, oh, we should be careful with our exemptions still, or maybe we should explain to them what exemptions mean or clarify or something. They just decided to make the whole thing exempt. No cleanup. That is also a lot of what we found in the 2013 Fish and Wildlife, where they said that it would improve habitat. A lot of that language went missing in 2018. My guess is that the DOE has made a few friends in the Fish and Wildlife Department, because they contradict themselves pretty radically. So I think DOE is using this for the basis of their exemptions that we're going to see. These are violations of the cleanup agreements. This is not a background cleanup, the way that they're going to use these exemptions. So even though the Department of Energy, Fish and Wildlife said there was an exemption, obviously if they're saying clean up everything in that area that is exempt, that's harmful, it's not really an exemption. Does that make sense? I know it's really complicated. Jenny, does that make sense?
Actually, I have to say that I find it confusing, but what I think is going to happen in the meetings next week with DTSC, I think that they're going to focus on this one.
Yeah.
That gets them, a smaller cleanup, a less expensive cleanup. And I don't think we're going to see any discussion of the Fish and Wildlife determination of 2013.
Yeah. And can I point out that this 2013 is closer to when the AOCs were written back in 2010. So up until the cleanups agreements were broken, this determination was moving forward the cleanup. This was what was on record. So the fact that they came in later with something that contradicted it is very fishy to me. Is not
Very fishy, but
also not even necessarily accurate or clear. But again, DTSC is going to allow DOE to run with this. So, okay, I'm doing my best to get this all out of my head and into yours in the most convenient and least complicated way possible. And I apologize if it's not. So we have the cleanup agreement, right? This big, bulky agreement. We have these really important exemptions that exist to protect what is irreplaceable, right? And we all agree that needs to be protected. However, they are only to be used if mitigation measures, which we're going to talk about right now, are insufficient to protect that precious thing. So if we've got the milk vetch and the mitigation measures are enough to say, yeah, come and do the cleanup, this mitigation measure will protect the plant so it won't die, then you don't exempt it. You use the mitigation measures. And if you go to our website, again, if you go to facts and then go down to cleanup myths, I've got some amazing photos of there when NASA did an interim cleanup at the Santa Susana Field Lab, and thanks to Bill Bowling, who helped share those photos, you can see that they've done mitigation measures that protected old growth trees during a small portion of an emergency cleanup that they did there. So these are some of the examples of the mitigation measures that we found in the EIR, and they're impressive. They're really well thought out. There's pages and pages and pages. And in the 2013 determination letter, that included mitigation measures of how to make sure you're protecting all these species while doing the cleanup. And you can notice like some of these are saying exactly what type of backfill needs to be used and how they're not going to do if there's wildlife species in the area where they're going to work, how a qualified biologist decides how to protect that animal during it. There's things that we didn't include here, but there are exemptions that we saw that you can't work at night, or if you do work at night, you have to make sure the lights don't go up under the trees and mess up the sleep cycles of the birds, and how the during rain you can't have any runoff go down into the wetlands. And I mean, they're very, very specific, and they're very helpful. They're good mitigation measures. And because these mitigation measures exist, they're more expensive. Some of them, like to use, like with the old growth trees that NASA they had to hand shovel out the dirt from the roots. They had to make sure that plant was not harmed. They couldn't just use a big forklift or a big, I don't know, forklift is the right word. I don't think you do those at
Digger.
trucks, tractors, boy words, I don't know. The excavators, they weren't able to do quick and dirty cleanup is what I'm saying. They had to do a more costly, time-consuming, delicate cleanup. These mitigation measures, a lot of them would require more delicate, time-consuming, expensive work. And so instead of wanting to use these, I think that the responsible parties are like, oh, we can't do mitigation measures. We just have to exempt it. We just won't do any cleanup at all. Because obviously that's a lot cheaper to not do a cleanup. So this is just a reminder of what our goal is. We do not want this hazardous test area, photo, copyright, William Preston Bowling, that shows the Santa Susana Field Lab. We want it to be back to its natural state, as close as possible. We want to protect the wildlife on the site, the wildlife near the site, and the people living nearby.
So I'm going to do the cultural protections, and I just want to reiterate that in the environmental impact report, there are mitigation measures, which are positive things. We agree with them 100%. There are cultural mitigation measures. There are biological mitigation measures. There's ones pertaining to air and I don't know what it was called, like visibility or something, what it looks like, okay? The aesthetic mitigation measures. And overall, what we're trying to get to is that we believe that the mitigation measures are thorough, they're comprehensive, they're protective, and they're sufficient. And no more exemptions need to be made that will allow the responsible parties out of their obligations to clean the site. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead into the cultural protections slides. So there is a sacred indigenous site at SSFL, if you don't know. It encompasses an area called the Burl Flats, and it has this image of the painted cave, but it also additionally encompasses and protects and excludes from cleanup almost a dozen acres of land. And if for some reason it is not appropriate for us to be showing this picture, I know that it's open source.
We asked. We
Oh, you
asked.
asked.
I did. I asked my indigenous
Okay.
friend if it would be respectful to show this, and she said it was okay.
Okay, fantastic.
She's
Because it is a sacred site, and we
a
recognize that.
a local tribe member, so she would know. She's been to the Burro Flats.
Beautiful.
We're good.
These protections, the cultural resources and features and artifacts are protected through not only our cleanup agreements, but through NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, through the National Historic Preservation Act, and other acts that you see here. They are extremely important to both the indigenous stakeholders and their descendants, but also to us and the people surround. I know that a lot of people on this call are very concerned and want these resources to be protected. And for anyone who questions how protected they are, I would suggest that you go to our website, click on the link to go to the PEIR and go to the mitigation measures and read. There's 20 pages of cultural exemption language, and I think it's extremely thorough. Next slide. This is one of the pages that describes, this isn't the mitigation measures, but this describes what type of cultural resources exist on site. It's everything from, painted caves, as we just saw, to lithic scatters and middens and rock shelters. It is quite extensive. The area was used by multiple groups, and we understand that those areas need to be preserved, and we believe that they are. But what we don't want is, in the biological exemptions, we talked about how DOE wants to improperly use biological exemptions to get out of a cleanup. And they tried to do that through their fish and wildlife determination. What we've seen at SSFL with NASA is that NASA tried to get the entire site, 2,850 acres, essentially exempt from cleanup by becoming a traditional. Sorry.
Is that the one? Is that where you want to be or no? Or are you just bringing it up now?
Oh, I don't know. But yes, this is where I want to be. Perfect. Thanks. And you look at the small boxes, that is the Burro Flats area. I think it's expanded a bit. I don't know that's exactly to scale. Is it, Melissa?
I don't know if it's to scale. I also don't know if that's actually where it is. I think we were given a generality so that way that they're protected.
Yes, but what NASA attempted to do was to have the entire SSFL site boundary exempted by becoming a sacred traditional cultural heritage landscape. So we opposed that only because part of that aim was to not do the cleanup, hand land over as excess to the Santa Chumash, and make it their responsibility to remediate. It's $1 billion cleanup. So NASA and the Department of Energy and Boeing should be paying for it. And after that, go ahead.
So I wanted to point out that this is the language from the AOC, that it has a cultural exemption in it for the same purpose of like, if the mitigation measures are insufficient, then you take that whole area out of the cleanup plan. Nothing touches it. But they have to be recognized, formally recognized as cultural resources.
For the intents and purposes of this slide presentation, I think what we want to communicate is that the cultural resources have been documented. They are being considered. There are acres being exempted from cleanup. During cleanup, there will be a cultural resource monitor on site. And if things need to be documented as we go through a cleanup, they will be. And that is a part of, no one has to fight for that. That is written into the cleanup agreements. So while people may disagree on how one categorizes archaeological sites, I think that the protections in the mitigation, the cultural mitigation measures are strong. I believe that they're comprehensive and they're thorough, and I think that they are sufficient to proceed with the cleanup.
All right. So, recap real quick. I know we're going through a lot fast, is that the cleanup agreements, the original background cleanup agreements had protections in order to make sure the biological resources and the cultural resources were protected both through mitigation measures, and should the mitigation measures be found ineffective or insufficient, then you would cause an exemption. And that's similar to what we see with like the Burro Flats painted caves, like, and the 11.74 acres surrounding it, that there will be no cleanup done there. That will be very much protected, which is important. That's great. We agree with that. So what we want to talk about now is what we are expecting to see at this NASA meeting is nothing new in the sense of NASA, Boeing, and the Department of Energy have been trying to get out of the cleanup pretty much since the ink dried on those agreements. They've been trying to break their promises. They've been trying to weasel around to break the promises because, again, it's cheaper to do less of a cleanup, right? So we're going to look at some of the ways that we have noticed this happening before, so we're not all shocked that they're doing it again. Okay, so back in 2019, NASA came out with a supplemental environmental impact report. Oh, pardon me, that's my alarm. They didn't need to. This was not required. If you watch In the Dark of the Valley, there is a lawyer who talks about how this was unnecessary and an attempt to just get out of the cleanup. So they gave the community four cleanup options. In cleanup option A, this is showing a background cleanup, right? This is AOC compliant. Everything in purple is what would be cleaned up in NASA's area. For example, this was a NASA presentation. You can see it's pretty comprehensive. Option C, however, is what they were pushing for, and this would show recreational cleanup. So you can see this is what they had promised us. This is what they were trying to push as a viable option for the cleanup. So you can see even since 2000, we said this is what, 2019? Um,
Yes.
they have been trying to get out of the cleanup. It actually goes back further than that, but this example is from 2019. You can see that they showed at this meeting, and if you remember from the documentary, this is the meeting where Dan almost got arrested for trying to have a public comment because he was trying to point out that these are hugely insufficient, that you can't just go from a background cleanup to option C cleanup and then say that there are no differences, no discernible differences to health and safety between this option and this option. It was shocking, right? So this is the kind of stuff that NASA has pulled before, trying to tell the community like, "Oh, sure, we promised you this. We'll give you that, but no one's going to notice. There's no health differences, no harm differences."
Can we just, for anyone who isn't as familiar with those maps, can you just go back to it?
Sure thing.
The one where you have all four or three options. Just to clarify, what they're saying is that there are no differences in impact to us, the people who live around the site, whether they do a full cleanup or they basically do nothing. And that is because DTSC says that contamination doesn't get off site. That's the reason why it doesn't matter for them, because they're going with a inaccurate assumption.
Well, and I'm sure they would probably say too that it doesn't cause any difference in health to the wildlife either, or to the groundwater supplies that are being contaminated by. I mean, essentially what we're saying is that NASA lies. Oh, we should get our shirts made up. I made a great new logo that says liars, and on the NASA logo, we have stickers, but we should have shirts for those meetings.
We should. Don't get distracted. Keep going.
Sorry. So, this is what Jenny was talking about. So, when in 2019, we all said, you guys, we're not going to fall for accepting a lesser cleanup, like we're not that dumb, then they're like, oh, well, let's try something more savvy. So, they nominated 2,850 acres of the SSFL as a cultural district. Now, if this was not at a toxic site, do you guys see this little like here, let me circle it up here. Can you guys see my mouse moving?
Yes.
This is Sage Ranch and this is Runkle Canyon all up here. If they had said, let's make this a cultural district, I'd be like, let's go, right? But this is all toxic land. And they're happening to say that the cultural benefits of this land exactly matches this red border, which is absurd. That's the outline of the Santa Susana property lines. And it's a big reason why when they made this nomination, it was not approved. Their 70-page nomination did not include any mention of the contamination that still remained on site. And they claimed that it just happened to coincide with the property lines, which was against what you're allowed to do for that. So they try to make it an artifact. Now, the thing that's really interesting, and thank goodness for Committee to Bridge the Gap, who They're kind of like the Nancy Drew Hardy boys of how to play this game. They found in this, oh, sorry, in the Senate hearing, do you see this little bill down here where it shows in yellow?
Yes.
I highlighted that to make it bigger that you can see in a bill language for NASA. They wrote that the maximum extent practicable, NASA shall include all traditional cultural properties and landscapes as artifacts that are formally recognized as cultural resources for the purposes of the AOC. So what they said is like, you know how we said that they had to be formally recognized artifacts to get a cultural exemption? NASA was trying to get a cultural exemption across the entire Santa Susana Field Lab to 100% get out of the cleanup. It's actually saying that. This is not made up. They actually try to get out of the complete cleanup for all polluters in 2020. I want to point out that NASA, when they nominated that cultural district in 2020, I mean, it was a classic case of greenwashing. They were trying to make themselves look like they were the heroes of the indigenous people, right? But up until that, and you can see all these newspaper clippings that I found from LA Times archives show that they didn't care at all. It says they didn't care about the Native American interests until it benefited them. So you can see down on this left side at the bottom, they were asking the indigenous people were asking NASA to enclose those painted caves in glass or to fence it off to make sure they couldn't be graffitied or to not do rocket engine test right next to them. And you can see the spokesman in a Rocketdyne Canoga Park office said, "We are still testing moon engines and Atlas Thor engines up there. We have no plans to discontinue the use of the acres." They didn't care. They knew that those caves existed when they built the rocket engine test right up next to them. And then on top of it, you can see that they have rare tours given a painting site. So even though they knew these existed, they were not giving open access to the indigenous people to come see them. It was very hard for them to get access up to the site. And here you can say Indians hope to explore the mountain cave of pictures. So NASA coming off like they're the hero of the indigenous people is totally false. They were just doing this to try to get out of the cleanup. So again, this is a little look back at the way that NASA has been trying to get out of the cleanup before. And then we see it with Department of Energy in 2018, their supplemental EIR introduced an open space cleanup for the first time, which again is the same as recreational, which is the same as pretty much doing nothing. Um, at this point, they hadn't even said that they would break out of the cleanup. They were just trying to introduce this as a way to get out of the cleanup without looking bad. And this letter that objected it was from the Federation of Scientists. I think it's the California Federation of Scientists. Uh,
Yes.
Called them out on it and said this is unacceptable. So we have a pattern of these polluters, NASA and Department of Energy that we're looking at today. Another time we can look at Boeing, that they have been trying to get out of this cleanup for years. It's not an accident what they're doing. Sometimes it's hard to want to admit that government agencies are doing something so wrong. But we have a pattern here. And it's important because when we see what they're doing now, that we are able to not be as shocked and to say, you might be telling me it's the truth, but I know it's not because you haven't told the truth in the past either. Okay, so, and oh, this is from the 2018 map, sorry. This is also showing that even in 2018, they were starting to show these exemptions as biological exemptions. This is kind of where it comes back to, where before they were saying, oh, we'll do the cleanup, we'll do the full background cleanup, we'll do it. And then they exempted all of their area, right? Anything green hatch mark here, they were proposing to not clean up and just leave it contaminated as part of their biological exemption. So again, this is old news.
So I will attempt to cover some of the newer news because it has not ended. And as we go through these meetings, it's important that we keep these, this historical timeline essentially in mind. So we are going to continue to look at how loopholes have been created through the improper use of cultural and biological exemptions to the order of letting the responsible parties plan to not remediate impacted soil. And next slide. This first map that we're going to look at, it's hard for me to see. And I guess the way I want you to look at it is everything that's colored is an exemption, is an area where they do not plan on doing cleanup. The only areas that they're planning on cleaning up are not just the gray areas, but the gray crosshatched.
And the dark green. That's the DOE.
And the dark
Do you see
green.
pea green?
Oh, the dark green.
The
Okay,
pea.
sorry. The mustard pea green. Okay.
Sure.
Not the mint.
Not the, no.
I hate this map, but it is what it is. So the pea green, baby poop, and the gray crosshatch are the only areas that they want to currently remediate at the SSFL. It's easier to see on the following slides where the cleanup areas are in green. So this is what we would actually be shooting for, the background cleanup. The areas in green are the areas that would be remediated if they implemented a cleanup to background as they are legally mandated to do in the 2010 AOCs.
Which is interesting because the first time I saw this, I always imagined the background cleanup meant everything at the site, like the entire 2,850 acres. You can see that's not actually even the background cleanup, which is the most extensive cleanup that we're pushing for, is not the entire site.
This is the cleanup that they are proposing to do now in the PEIR that was released in 2023 that incorporates the settlement. Was that 2022? No, it's 2023. That incorporates the settlement agreement. So that settlement agreement incorporated the, please stop, incorporated the, sorry, my daughter was trying to probably ask for screen time. Yes, if that's what you're asking for. Okay, so the improper implementation of biological and cultural exemptions that was in the settlement agreement that was published in the PEIR now leaves us with this.
I'm going to do
Well,
it back
the
and forth.
biological. Yeah.
Yeah. The cultural exemptions aren't shown because those areas are sensitive and they don't want the public to know where they are.
We can get a better idea by going to the next slide, which gives us a chart. They have simply spelled it out. They have done the math for us about the amount of acreage they do not intend to clean up because they have an exemption that they are planning on applying. And that lets them out of 338 acres. That's over 60% for DOE and NASA. Boeing is planning with the implementation of the settlement agreement into the most recent final PEIR document to not clean up over 90% of the site. And they have done that through weakening the cleanup standards themselves. Here you can see a chart that Committee to Bridge the Gap has put together several years ago, showing just a couple PCBs and some dioxins. These are individual constituents, Arcalor 1016. What is that? I don't know, but I know it's toxic. So you can see that it was weakened. Ultimately, once you apply these biological exemptions
And loopholes?
It reduces the cleanup standards for these constituents to factors of up to, what's the highest number here? Over 2,000 times. So this isn't just, it's a 30% weaker cleanup. They have let themselves out of a cleanup. And so we need to remember that when they're giving us excuses about lack of capacity at laboratories next week. Go for it, Melissa.
So now, just to summarize again, we've seen why the site is so toxic to humans and to wildlife, how those loopholes have been created out of something that was meant to be protective, those exemptions. They've widened them into giant loopholes. We saw how much cleanup has been reduced for NASA and Department of Energy on that map because of those loopholes. Now, this soil smarts meeting coming up isn't going to be talking about, hold on, I'm going back to that map. So this is showing the biological exemptions. And you can see, like, let's look at the Department of Energy Area 4. They're talking about that they will do a background cleanup to what's left of the area. So kind of like what's in this gray area. This green area wouldn't be cleaned up at all. And now they're questioning if the background cleanup will even work for what's left of the cleanup that they're giving us. That's what we're looking out for. So last year, there came out a lab reporting methods and backfill source study. We have a link to that. You can use it either from this PDF when we put it out or from our website. And they are saying that they're running into two issues with providing a background cleanup for what's left of what they've given us for the cleanup. And that is to determine able to test the contaminants of concern, right? All those different 300 and some 50 contaminants on site, that they're not finding labs good enough to actually determine results for them. So this is what we're looking for, right? Yeah, Jenny.
I just want to say that I was reading that today. I haven't read the whole 200 pages, but I started to get into it, sent a couple emails to experts, and the response of people who know is that the way this works is you hire the lab to do the job and they do the job. It's not that we're asking for something that isn't doable. It is very much doable.
Yeah. Yeah. And also how can they not find, so they're saying that they might not find labs who can measure contaminants that low in the soil samples. So I guess they just can't clean it up. Whoops, not their fault. They may argue that they'll even have to adjust those lookup tables. Do you remember how we said that with the chemical contamination, it's not based on the natural radioactive study, but for the chemical contamination, it's based on those lookup tables. They might have to adjust those lookup tables to meet their needs if they can't find a lab to do it. That would break a background cleanup promise pretty swiftly. And
if they, sorry to interrupt you, but if they change the lookup table values, folks, they are weakening the cleanup standards.
yeah, big time, big time. It would be not a background cleanup anymore. And then they might push to use bias labs that will give them the results they want. So it's really questionable if they're saying that they cannot find labs to work with. The Santa Susana Field Lab is not the only toxic site in the country. There have been places that have been able to determine sources. I don't know if it's also maybe that they want the results really fast. And so they're saying, we shouldn't have to wait to get these results back. We want something immediate and we can't find a lab to do it. Pretty much this is a dance and show of getting out of the background cleanup. It's offensive. They may try to break out of their background promises for what's left of the site, what's left of the cleanup in the DOE and NASA areas by saying that they can't find backfill. So backfill, as you guys know, this cleanup is going to take removing a lot of dirt. And we've got some issues with that. We've talked about that before, about how they probably inflated how much dirt they need to move. Maybe they don't have to move as much because we don't want them to move healthy, clean soil, obviously. Like, just do what's contaminated. They've probably inflated that amount because then they can say, oh, we can't find enough soil to put back. That's backfill. After they've removed the contaminated soil, they have to go out and look either in California, or I guess they're saying within 3 hours, they have to source, and we're not sure if that's legitimate or not. They have to source a location where they can bring in enough soil to repair the natural environment. And they're saying, well, they don't think they can find it. I've heard
They're alluding to that being a difficulty.
So that way they won't have to do it. They might claim they can't find enough clean backfill, but the point of the clean backfill that was listed in the AOC was not to find, again, this unicorn of non-existent, perfect, healthy, miraculous soil. It was to find the closest to it. Find what works. Make sure you're not putting contaminated soil back in. That's all it's looking for. Um, so they might try to say, oh, well, I guess we can't find enough backfill. We'll just not dig as deep, or we won't do as much of a cleanup. They might claim that the background study was flawed. Um, the one, remember we saw the picture of the mule with the gamma scanners on its back? They might say that that study was flawed and can't be trusted. And although it wasn't a perfect study, um, it could have been even more stringent, in my opinion, but it was fair. It's fair enough. It's fairly comprehensive and it should be used. There's no reason to redo a background study. Not only would that cost millions and millions of dollars, but it would delay the cleanup. Is not necessary. And I can guarantee you, if they did another background cleanup, somehow they would find less contamination than the first time. And I'm feeling that. They might again argue that they have to adjust the lookup tables to make it more reasonable. Or they might have, I think this last constraint on lab was meant to go on to the last page. Because this
That would
one,
be my fault.
that's okay. Because of backfill. So, and I've heard this for a long time from a few dissenters of cleanups, which is strange to me that that can exist. But there are a few people in our community who may or may not have Boeing ties or Department of Energy grants being given to their organizations, that they have said that this background just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's just too hard to get. And it seems pretty overcomable. Is that a word? Achievable. We don't see really any good reason from the people we've talked to why this can't be reasonably achieved.
One other thing that I'm not certain that I understand, but I want to bring up and flag for folks that are planning on attending the DTSC meetings, Soil Smart workshops, is I found in the document that we're discussing right now, that, like I said, I haven't read the whole thing, but in one of the tables, it said that they will not be sampling for radioactive constituents outside of Area 4 for the backfill samples. And I have to honestly say, I do not know the significance of that table. I'm hoping that it does not mean that they aren't going to be looking for radioactive contaminants and doing sampling in areas outside of Area 4. But because at the beginning of the meeting, when I said to look at that fine print, when it's talking about background cleanup of chemical constituents, I want us all to remember in these soil conversations with DTSC that there's radioactive contamination throughout the site. There was not a wall keeping it in. There was a partial nuclear meltdown, and there's fallout all over, even beyond the site boundaries. So I'm hoping that that's not what they're attempting to do. Minimize the radioactive contamination on site with the aim of not having to pay for it, cleaning it up. But I want us all to just be listening.
Right. With our ears very open and eyes wide open. So this is our new Cleanup Miss Busted. I love that little smug fox right there. And I would, highly recommend you guys going. There's some deeper reading to be done there. We tried to put everything in our brain on the website for you, so that way you can have the information you need to make educated decisions and informed questions.